The term limit state strikes again. Hi, I'm Philip Blumel. Welcome to No Uncertain Terms, the official podcast of the Term Limits Movement for the week of May 15th, 2023.
Your sanctuary from partisan politics.
After a 5-year battle that weaved through town hall meetings, the state Supreme Court, a Constitutional Revision Commission, the legislature multiple times, and to the governor's office, again, multiple times, the bill has finally passed both houses and the governor signed off on it last week. Now it is finally official. School board members of all 69 school districts in the term limit state are now limited to 8 years in office. Boom. But which state are we talking about? Well, I'll give you some hints. 1, it is the state with the most term limits on the books. 2, it is the state ranked number 1 for economic performance by the American Legislative Exchange Council in their 2023 rankings. 3, it is the state that is ranked number 1 for internal migration, that is, migration between the states, for the last 5 years. And 4, it was the first state to officially apply for the Term Limits Convention, that is, to approve a resolution calling for an amendment writing convention under Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution limited to the subject of congressional term limits. That's right, we're talking about Florida. And now, Florida has struck again, term limiting 358 school board members in 69 districts to 8 years in office. Congratulations. Now, U.S. Term Limits has been working on this project since 2017, when we were pushing legislation to impose 8-year term limits on these school boards. And also that year, the state's Constitutional Revision Commission was ramping up. And U.S. term limits activists were crowding town hall meetings at that time, calling for a statewide referendum on 8-year school board term limits. But what a roller coaster that we have been on since then. The Constitutional Revision Commission is an organization that's called up every 20 years and has town hall meetings around the state, and ultimately the people on the commission recommend certain amendments to be placed on the ballot for a popular vote in changing the Constitution. Well, the Constitution Revision Commission did indeed place 8-year school board limits on the ballot, but at the last minute, they were yanked off the ballot by the Supreme Court of Florida. Not because there was a problem with the term limits measure, but because the term limits measure was packaged with another measure that they said did not pass constitutional muster, so that multi-issue referendum did not make it on the ballot. All right, so back to the legislature we went, where the idea lost, but then it was revived again, and then the bill passed, but it had been co-opted by politicians who passed a watered-down 12-year version. What a lame ploy. And, you know, we've seen it many times. Politicians see the polls, of course, and they'd like to wrap themselves in the term limits flag while they wink at special interests and the career politicians who support them. You know, 12-year term limits are hardly term limits at all. You could call them the politician's term limit because they only are passed when politicians see that the only alternative is the 8-year or even 6-year term limits that voters actually want. Anyways, with this 5 years of momentum behind us and a governor, Ron DeSantis, who took the lead to overturn last year's betrayal, the deed is now done. So I live in Florida, yes, so maybe I'm biased, but I would love to hand the mantle of the term limit state to another state. California, North Carolina, Tennessee, Maine. Let's see what you got. Thanks to Senator Blaise Ingoglia from Spring Hill, who carried the bill in the Senate, where it passed 30-7, and Representative Alex Rizzo of Hialeah, which carried the bill in the House, where it passed 79-29. Interestingly, the Senate version included county commissioner term limits of 8 years. Now, most of the largest counties in Florida are already term limited, but not all the counties are. Plus, some of the county commissions are 12 years, although most are 8 years. And then, of course, there's the case of Pinellas County, the home of St. Petersburg, probably the most corrupt county in the state, where voters overwhelmingly approved 8-year term limits at the ballot box, but the county refused to insert them into the charter. And that deserves some redress, and that was part of the point of this addition to the school board bill to add county commissions. But I digress. So why were term limits so important for school boards? I mean, aren't these sleepy little elections, and a lot of mothers and local people get involved in school boards as a public service, right? Well, maybe in some places they do. But in Florida, unlike most states, Florida pays its school board members, and these officials have enormous power as they move billions of dollars into construction projects. Hence, money flows into campaigns of these politicians. So this is a toxic combination which makes incumbents nearly unbeatable, just like in the U.S. Congress. And of course, this is important to the career school board members. I mean, in Miami-Dade, Broward, Palm Beach, and Orange counties, the salary is over $44,000 annually for what is essentially a part-time job. Now, keep in mind, these school board members aren't running the school district. They have a professional manager that they hire, a superintendent of schools, to do that. So in preparing this segment in celebration of this victory, I came across a U.S. term limits handout from 2018 that was making its rounds, making the case for school board term limits. And I want to share with you a couple of the arguments we were making for this because they're really good arguments that apply to term limits at all levels. One is that term limits foster regular open seat elections. That's really the number one reason for term limits anywhere for elected officials. Second, term limits encourage independence by the school board. And that's because term limits will regularly sever the relationships that would naturally grow up between special interests and incumbent school board members. Next, term limits improve citizen access to the process. They encourage candidates to run for office and to work on meaningful campaigns, and they increase voter participation in elections. Term limits encourage new faces and fresh ideas, of course. Incumbent members often have their heels dug in over past political battles or are wedded to the special interests that they have relied on for re-election time after time again. Term limits mandate rotation in office, which expands the circle of citizens with an intimate knowledge of how the school board works, and that is essential at local level bodies of government. Term limits encourage transparency and discourage corruption, and term limits create a level playing field between the school board and Florida's other political offices, most of which already have 8-year term limits. As I mentioned, Governor DeSantis had endorsed this amendment, and he wrote that, quote, "No elected office, whether federal or local, is ever better off when run by career politicians." No kidding. Well, we'll probably hear DeSantis bragging about this victory if he announces a run for president. Speaking of the presidential campaign, Nikki Haley was the first announced candidate to come out in favor of congressional term limits. Well, last week, she took the next step, signing a U.S. term limits pledge that specifically committed her to supporting 3-2 term limits. That is, 3 terms in the House and 2 in the Senate. The U.S. term limits amendment, currently introduced in Congress with about 130 pledged supporters, is a 3-2 amendment. Now, the importance of this step is that she isn't just speaking generally because she's seen polls. She's putting her support where it counts on a real bill that is introduced right now with co-sponsors right now. So way to go, Nikki. Thank you. Now, as I announced, was it last week, maybe the week before in our last podcast, candidate Vivek Ramaswamy also sent in a pledge. So 2 of the announced candidates have already sent a signed pledge to U.S. term limits. And last week, while campaigning in Iowa, Ramaswamy posted a video bragging about signing the term limits pledge. Let's hear it.
We're in the middle of our bus tour here in Iowa, and I just got to say I am proud to have signed the term limits pledge, favoring a constitutional amendment in this country that would limit congressmen to 3 terms and U.S. senators to 2 terms, keeping fresh lifeblood in our government. It's also a big part of the reason why I've said that I want to limit even federal bureaucrats to working for no more than 8 years, just like the U.S. president is limited to those 2 terms. so it should as well be for U.S. senators, so it should be 3 terms for U.S. congressmen as well. It's a great grassroots organization. This is what it's going to take to breathe the civic lifeblood back into our country, and that's why I'm supporting it.
I love it. I can't wait for the debates.
This is a public service announcement.
Pressure and preemption are rising buzzwords in the term limits movement, and there's a good reason for it. Now that 6 states have passed a standalone Article 5 convention call limited to congressional term limits, politicians in Washington, D.C. are noticing. What will happen when there's 12 states or 24 states? Increasingly, observers and even politicians themselves recognize that states calling for an amendment proposing convention under Article 5 of the Constitution puts a lot of pressure on Washington politicians to take the initiative to amend the Constitution themselves. Oh, but politicians will never term limit themselves, right? Well, I wouldn't be too sure of that. I mean, what happens if 30 of the 34 states required apply for an Article 5 convention on the subject of congressional term limits? At that point, politicians will see the writing on the wall. They'll see that it's going to happen anyway. And do they want to have a bunch of state legislators who want their jobs in Washington write those rules? Or do you think Congress is going to get on their soapboxes and write the rules themselves? Well, at a recent forum in Maine with U.S. term limits own Ken Quinn, a bipartisan duo of politicians from that state agreed that Congress would act. U.S. Representative Jared Golden, a Democrat, and State Senator Rick Bennett, a Republican, agree Congress would act preemptively if they perceive that the states have enough momentum to hold a term limits convention.
What happens is that once a certain number of states get to threaten an Article 5 convention, Congress has historically said, okay, we hear you. We hear you, we're going to make the amendment ourselves. And then the congressional path that Congressman Golden has been leading on will take root at that point. So I think both of these are important to pursue at the same time.
For those of you who may not remember, back in the 1990s, term limits was very popular around the country. 23 states passed laws, and most of them were at the ballot box to put term limits on their own congressional delegations. Maine did it as well, twice. The people voted for this. Unfortunately, what happened, those laws got challenged. It went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in the decision, U.S. term limits versus Thornton, the Supreme Court overturned all those state laws and ruled that the only way term limits can be imposed on members of Congress was through the amending provision of Article 5. So, for those of you that are not familiar with Article 5, there's only 2 ways to propose amendments. Either 2/3 of both houses of Congress need to propose it and then send it out to the states for ratification. That's how we've had all of our amendments proposed up to this point. The second option is if 2/3 of the state legislatures apply for a convention to propose an amendment, then the states can meet and propose that amendment, and then at the same ratification takes 3/4 of the states to ratify. So U.S. term limits, we are advancing this both ways. We have an amendment in Congress that was introduced by Representative Ralph Norman from South Carolina. It's HJR 11, and I want to thank the congressman for being one of the first co-sponsors of that amendment, that resolution, and also for signing our pledge. We have 130 members of Congress that have signed our pledge saying they will vote for this amendment. So we're making some really good headway. What I primarily focus my time on is the second option, which is getting the state legislatures to propose this without the consent of Congress. What a beautiful thing. We don't need Congress to get this done. And so we have, and this just came out yesterday, an Article 5 application was introduced by Senator Bennett here. I want to thank you for taking the lead on that. And I'm very encouraged by what's been happening. So this is an application specifically for one amendment, term limits for Congress. And so we're hoping that we're going to get down the field with this one. And my question to you, Senator, is why, first of all, why is this important? Why do you think it's important for the state legislatures to take this pathway?
Because first and foremost, I don't have a lot of confidence that Congress is going to do this. It's sort of antithetical to incumbent congressional interests by its nature. But part of the history that you didn't relate is that a lot of the amendments to the Constitution that have been adopted started as Article 5 initiatives, because Congress is often loath to act until they're kind of forced to on any of these big questions. And I think you can generate, there's much more connection directly to the people in the state legislatures. And so you can generate passion and interest in a given issue at the state legislative level. And then what happens is that once a certain number of states get to threaten an Article 5 convention, Congress has historically said, okay, we hear you. We hear you, we're going to make the amendment ourselves. And then the congressional path that Congressman Golden has been leading on will take root at that point. So I think both of these are important to pursue at the same time. But, listen, I know that Congressman Golden is very accessible. By the way, our congressional delegation in Maine, people don't realize this about how accessible all 4 members of our congressional delegation are. It's unique. I talk to people from other states and they say, like, you can actually get your congressman on the phone. And it's not just because I'm a state senator. It's like you talk to people all the time. And I know that Senator Collins and the others do as well. They're very accessible. And if you go to Washington to meet, chances are you're going to meet your actual member of Congress, not just a staffer. And so it's not the same way in other states. and they're a little bit more removed, a little bit more protected, a little bit more, walled off. And so I think it's really important for people to speak. And it's great, as you pointed out, Ken, it's wonderful that we have this alternative path because they have worked historically in tandem. And I'm happy that we can generate the interest in a formal way at the state legislative level to ask Congress to act, but also in failing that, to act ourselves.
Yeah, that's a great point. And actually, I did a little research. 17 of our amendments have started through this process.
Oh.
So out of the 33 that have been proposed, 27 were ratified and became part of the Constitution. But 17 of them started through the states, through the Article 5 application, the Bill of Rights being specifically the first time. Now, the difference between the application that we have and the amendment in Congress, I want to explain the difference. The amendment in Congress, HJR 11, calls for limits 2 terms for a U.S. Senator, so that would be 2 6-year terms for 12 years, and 3 terms for a member of the House, so that would be 3 2-year terms. So technically, one person could serve in Congress between both chambers 18 years. Plenty of time to get the job done that the people sent you there to do. With the application that you're sponsoring, that we did not specify the number of terms. We want the states to have that discussion when they meet. And so that's the path that we're taking. And Congressman, I'm curious to get your intake on this, your view. With the pressure coming from the states, first of all, what do you think of that idea? And then secondly, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think Congress will typically take the path of least resistance and propose it themselves?
I don't want to demoralize anyone sitting around. I don't think that the Congress is going to do that. Not this Congress and not any future Congress. I think it's highly unlikely without a significant amount of pressure coming up from the American people. And the easiest way to do that is through the state legislatures. So
if we get close to the 34, what do you think will happen?
I tend to take the cynical view of Congress, and nevertheless, I choose to go there, which I've come to the conclusion makes me very optimistic. Right? The fact that a secret optimist, but I don't. I've got a lot of criticisms to offer of the United States Congress and how things are done. So, the cynical take is that if enough states are on the verge of calling a convention of states for the purpose of visiting the issue of term limits, that the Congress might act to assume them while grandfathering their current selves in without term limits, and let it take place with the passage of time. That sounds fairly accurate to me.
Like the show? You can help by subscribing and leaving a 5-star review on both Apple and Spotify. It's free.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of No Uncertain Terms. The term limits convention bills are moving through the state legislatures. This could be a breakthrough year for the term limits movement. To check on the status of the term limits convention resolution in your state, go to termlimits.com/takeaction. There, you will see if it has been introduced and where it stands in the committee process on its way to the floor vote. If there's action to take, you'll see a Take Action button by your state. Click it. This will give you the opportunity to send a message to the most relevant legislators, urging them to support the legislation. They have to know you are watching. That's termlimits.com/takeaction. If your state has already passed the term limits convention resolution, or the bill's not been introduced in your state, you can still help. Please consider making a contribution to U.S. term limits. It is our aim to hit the reset button on the U.S. Congress, and you can help. Go to termlimits.com/donate. termlimits.com/donate. Thanks. We'll be back next week.
Find us on most social media at US Term Limits. Like us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and now LinkedIn.
USTL